Hi there, I am Dr. Jay Watkins. I'm a lecturer here in the history department. I teach mostly across the modern US curriculum, but my research is really confined to the queer South. Today I want to talk about some of the ways that our queer culture might help us. This is currently part of my larger project about queer theater in the South, which is of its own part of a larger interest in queer culture more broadly. Some of the ways that we transmit culture and some of the kinds of culture that we end up transmitting. My talk today will focus on some of the legacies of activism and the world that we've created for our kids. I'll start with some of the stats about growing up queer, talk about some of the history of gay and queer politics, and explore some of the ways that a departure from a radical queer politics in favor of an LGBTQ assimilation politics over really the last 3 decades has created a shiny liberal veneer of diversity whilst making life worse and harder for many. Over the next few minutes, you'll hear me use the words queer, gay, LGBT, LGBTQ+, quite a lot. And these can have some overlap, but they're not necessarily synonymous. Queer is a word with quite a history. It's gone from pejorative to a reclaimed identity descriptor. It doesn't really have a precise definition, and it's really elastic enough to cover multitudes. Scholar Sue Ellen Case wrote this definition in a 1991 article that, quote, "The queer, unlike the rather polite categories of gay and lesbian, revels in the discourse of the loathsome. The outcast, the idiomatically prescribed position of same-sex desire. Unlike petitions for civil rights, queer revels constitute a kind of activism that attacks the dominant notion of the natural. The queer is the taboo breaker, the monstrous, the uncanny." This is one of the more deliciously subversive definitions, and I take a lot of inspiration from it. I use queer in a way that connotes an intersectional opposition to narrow identity politics. As gay and lesbian traded their radicalness for conformity in the 80s, queer became the preferred term for those in opposition. LGBT and the subsequent expanding acronym is a specific kind of politics that privileges identity categories over other kinds of politics. This certainly has its place, but it can really only take us so far. So the radical gayness of my title and the queerness of recent decades have a lot of overlap, and I want us to reclaim the radicality of our gayness. David Wojnarowicz provides us with a powerful description of gay awakening in his 1991 memoir, Close to the Knives, a memoir of disintegration. In it, he says, quote, "I almost lost consciousness because of the power of the unconscious desires suddenly surfacing, and for a week afterward I plotted murder because of fears that the guy would tell someone and I'd be locked up or institutionalized and given electroshock, and how I studied my face in the mirror day after day to see if what I experienced was written there, and the confusion I felt wondering if I'd become this hateful thing, and yet my face remained the same. For months afterward, I searched the public library for information on my condition and found only sections of novels or manuals that described me as either a speed freak sitting on a child's swing in a playground at dusk inventing new words for faggot, or that people like me spoke with lisps and put bottles up their asses and wore dresses and had limp wrists, and every novel I read that had references to queers described them as people who killed or destroyed themselves for no other reason than realization of how terrible they were for desiring men, and I felt I had no choice but to grow up and assume these shapes and characteristics. And I grew up living a schizophrenic existence in the family and in a social structure where every ad in every newspaper, TV, and magazine was a promotion for heterosexual coupling, sunlit muscle heads, and beach bunnies. And in every playground, invariably, there's a kid who screamed faggot in frustration at some other kid, and the sound of it resonated in my shoes. That instant solitude, that breathing glass wall that no one saw. That was written in 1991, about 1962. Some things have gotten better, some have not. Most pre-GLB kids don't grow up in queer homes. They grow up in a mostly straight heteronormative environment. Despite a world that seems increasingly more accepting, the reality for most queer kids is that they grow up in environments, despite how supportive their parents may be, they grow up in environments outside of the home that remain toxic. Bullying is rampant, and school systems do little about it, still to this day. Generations of queer folk have reached adulthood scarred. Michael Hobbs wrote in 2015 that, quote, "Growing up gay, it seems, is bad for you in many of the same ways as growing up in extreme poverty." Now, this can have a profound and long-lasting consequences for queer people. A 2015 study showed that queer people as adults produced less cortisol, the hormone that regulates stress. Quote, "Their systems were activated so constantly in adolescence that they ended up more sluggish as grown-ups than their straight counterparts." A 2014 study similarly showed that stressful life events inflict more damage on pre-GLB kids' nervous systems than on their straight peers' nervous systems. One of the architects of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACE for short, Dr. Vincent Felitti, when discussing what type of childhood trauma did the most damage, said, quote, "The one with the slight edge by 15% over the others was chronic recurrent humiliation, what we termed emotional abuse." Wojnarowicz in 1962, me in 1992. The continued taunting and gender policing of every other little boy and girl who is insufficiently masculine or feminine before they ever realize any kind of desire is emotional abuse. Now, why do school systems and many people in this country continue to push against any kind of positive queer education, especially sex ed? One reason is that there is still a cultural taboo against teaching kids about sex. Couple that with the idea that homosexuality is only sexual behavior rather than an innate identity, and you end up with a culture that relegates all things queer to the world of adults, because anything gay is always already obscene. Pitched battles over what and when we teach young people about sex have raged as long as there have been schools in this country. The idea is that if we teach kids about sex, they will go out and do it. In fact, the opposite is true. Teaching kids about safe sex, about sex generally, decreases sexual activity, decreases risky sexual activity, it cuts rates of STIs, and it cuts rates of unwanted pregnancies dramatically, and we have a lot of data that supports this. This is Desmond Naples. He is shot to fame over the last few years as a drag kid, and he is one of many out there. He's 12, and he's been doing drag for years. He currently has 171,000 followers on Instagram. He has appeared in Converse ads, that right there. He's a regular Pride Parade attendee. He's a special case, of course, given how supportive his family is. However, because society still largely presumes that LGBTQ plus cultures and queerness is, quote, "a deeply and perversely erotic subculture," end quote, many adults believe that a preteen like Desmond, who has come out, plays regularly with gender, and who revels in his nonconformity, could not possibly be doing so voluntarily. Conservative media have accused his mom, Wendy, of endangering her son. Some people have even gone so far as to call New York Child Protective Services. Now, this adult disquiet over nonconforming kids allows for and fosters the continued neglecting of nascent queerness, leaving pre-GLB kids like Desmond and countless others across the country to be mocked rather than affirmed, fostering yet another generation of queer people who carry scars into adulthood. Now, of course, we have absolutely no problem heterosexualizing teens and young children. How many otherwise well-meaning folks have said of little boys, "Oh, he's such a heartbreaker," or "he's going to be such a heartbreaker one day"? Or how many of them have used girlfriend, boyfriend to talk about children's friendships? Recently, a party to reveal a baby's genitalia started one of the wildfires in California. And we have an entire industry for crazy, quote, "gender reveal parties." These, of course, should more accurately be named genital reveal. The number of people who go to extravagant lengths to tell people about their baby's genitalia is astounding. A student recently, this semester, in my Sex in America course, reported that part of the sex education curriculum at their high school was a marriage project where they were partnered with a random classmate, opposite sex, of course, and had to plan a wedding. We've also constructed entire industries around socializing young people into heterosexual coupledom. Middle school Valentine's dances or prom ring a bell, but God forbid, if kids are queer, they somehow can't decide that until they're 18. Now, make no mistake, there are pre-gay kids, And there is something to queerness long before any kind of sexual desire is awakened. A number of studies have shown that children who eventually come out as LGBTQ+ demonstrate more childhood gender nonconformity in their speech, body language, and in their choice of activity than their pre-straight contemporaries do. These reports have also produced evidence of a dosage effect. The more gender nonconformity someone shows in childhood, the more likely they will identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual as an adult. Psychology professor Richard Lippa is quoted in a recent Atlantic article that's titled, "When Kids Are Straight Until Proven Otherwise," saying, quote, "The link between childhood gender nonconformity and adult sexual orientation is one of the strongest relationships between a childhood trait and an adult phenotype that's been demonstrated in all of psychology." The link is, of course, not perfect, and there are many, many paths to adult homosexuality, but for a lot of people, there is a pre-sexual queerness. Now, you might ask why I started with stats about our kids. I wanted to situate us for thinking about the last few decades of activism. I'd like to turn now to the queer past to examine some of the ways that we've gotten here, think about ways we might go forward, and I'll wrap up with a charge to go forth. Now, there have long been different political ideas around queerness, around queer issues. In very broad strokes, one pushes for assimilation. It's these folks over here. These are the suit and tie gays that don't want any trouble, and they wish that everyone would just behave so that they can prove they are just like straight people, except for what they do in bed, which is really nobody's business anyway. The other politics pushes for liberation for all, regardless of respectability. This grew out of the intersectional liberation movements of the late 1960s and fought against oppression by the capitalist heteropatriarchy. A great deal of what seems to be progress has been made over the last 50 years for LGBT folks. The politics of assimilation has certainly brought increasing participation in the nation state for a narrow band of these people. So how did we make such progress on, quote, gay rights? Well, a shift from a politics of liberation to a politics of assimilation. Scholar Michael Bronski wrote, quote, "Gays are just like straights, except for what they do in bed," was a more tolerable line in a world frightened by the idea of gay revolution now and gay pride chants like 2468, smash the family, smash the state. In the 1970s, early gay liberation groups began to ally themselves with the Black Panther Party, international feminist movements, international trade unions, and transnational liberation movements of all kinds. And here, of course, I mean gay in the way that they tried to. Everyone in the sexual minority camp. Sometimes you'll hear this GSM, gender and sexual minorities. Now, gays and lesbians with power, privilege, and money, however, they cozied up to those already with political power to work against these various liberation movements that threatened American domination or the military-industrial complex. Some of our rights organizations then toned down their message to make it more palatable during the devastation of the AIDS crisis, when the specter of diseased queer bodies storming the gates terrified America. ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, on the other hand, told the government, the pharmaceutical industry, and conservative America to, quote, go fuck themselves, end quote, and did more for the lives of queer people than the Human Rights Campaign with their fancy black tie dinners has ever done. The radical gayness that saw all oppression as connected is the kind of radical gayness that has been lost in neoliberal identity politics, and one of the reasons the Democrats have failed so miserably. In the 80s, brands began to recognize that the gays were a sizable market. Soon, major brands were advertising in the gay press, and we began to confuse being advertised to for being accepted. This came at the cost of the radical gayness or anything that might threaten advertising dollars. What it meant to be gay became contested across the country as more and more gays went out shopping and started to ape respectability while initiating a retrenchment of variety of expression. Mainstream gays were granted privilege by peering over the wall and saying, we are just like you, we are capable of healthy relationships, we can keep it in our pants and settle down. Pride became, quote, family friendly. We had Ellen, we had Will and Grace. Privileged white gay men stopped dying of AIDS because of protease inhibitors. Bourgeois neoliberal identity politics became the focus and led to a rainbowification of everything. Then came Mayor Pete. On the surface, Mayor Pete seems to show us the aspirational trajectory from abjection to acceptance, something of a role model for our young people. But 17 years ago, Mayor Pete would have been a felon in 11 states just by virtue of the sex he has or is imagined to have. Now, of course, he is married, he ran for president, and he posed with his husband on the cover of Time like a Norman Rockwell painting. For a while there, it looked like we might have our first gay president before our first female president, because when, like many other mainstream Democrats, he promised to uphold for-profit health care and make sure that nothing would threaten the profit and wealth of the ruling class, regardless of what was good for the country. He occupies the position of too much and not enough. He is too gay for some and too straight for others. He and Chasten are of us, but they are of the other. Because all outward appearances look like the schema of bourgeois respectability, we aren't supposed to talk about what he and Chasten do in bed. But the kind of sex he has is a really big deal for a large part of the voting public, because like I said earlier, queerness is already always obscene to many. In 2007, scholar Jasbir Puar released her monumental work, Terrorist Assemblages, Homonationalism in Queer Times. It was and remains one of the most important queer critiques of the 21st century. I highly recommend it. Puar came up with this analytical framework because she was frustrated with the feminist and queer theories that held the nation state as heteronormative and that the queer is inherently or is always an outlaw. Terrorist Assemblages, quote, developed a conceptual frame of homonationalism for understanding the complexities of how acceptance and tolerance for gay and lesbian subjects have become a barometer by which the right to and capacity for national sovereignty are evaluated. It has since morphed to include any time that LGBTQ plus politics are co-opted or marshaled in support of nationalistic politics. We saw this at work recently when on June 15th of this year, the Supreme Court decided in favor of an expansive reading of Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act by ruling that an employer can't fire someone just for being LGBT. Thanks, Justice Ginsburg. That same day, though, the same day that SCOTUS announced I could not be fired, however, it, including our liberal savior RBG, opened the way for an environmentally devastating natural gas pipeline under the Appalachian Trail. Thanks, Justice Ginsburg. On June 25th, SCOTUS ruled 7-2 with only Sotomayor and Kagan dissenting, that upheld a law that asylum claims of persecution at home that were rejected at the border had no right to appeal in federal court. ICE has regularly denied due process to LGBTQ asylum seekers. It will only get worse now. And now, of course, we find out that ICE facilities have sterilized a lot of detained women. Thanks, Justice Ginsburg. The silence of my LGBTQ plus kin is deafening. Homonationalism dovetails with another phenomenon, pinkwashing or rainbow capitalism. All of those mean very similar things. Now, this is a process whereby governments and capitalist entities publicly proclaim support for LGBTQ rights in order to look progressive, moderate, or tolerant, or modern and tolerant. Pinkwashing is a strategy designed to conceal distressing realities and uncomfortable truths. The problem with inclusion at all costs is that it's something of a Faustian pact. Wells Fargo sponsors Pride, but finances the Dakota Access Pipeline and was fined recently for discriminating against minority customers. Lockheed Martin proudly proclaims its LGBT inclusion, but it sells the weapons that anti-gay countries use to murder their queer citizens. AT&T launched a partnership with the Trevor Project and sponsors Pride, but in the 2018 election cycle gave 61% of its federal contributions to anti-gay Republicans, claiming that it will always direct its money in the interest of the business, regardless of the issues. Our kids are being conditioned to consume and look the other way because the business paints a rainbow on their door. Now, all liberal gay rights groups uphold certain ideas of progress and modernity. And here I make a distinction between liberal and left. The Human Rights Campaign is liberal, and it gives a perfect score to the corporations I just mentioned, and until very recently worked against non-discrimination laws that included trans people, because supposedly other genders made straight people with power and money uncomfortable. It also continues to give money to anti-gay Republicans. On the other hand, left organizations like ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and Reclaim Pride oppose transphobia, homophobia, biphobia, racism, sexism, xenophobia, bigotry based on religious affiliation, classism, ableism, autism, ageism, all other forms of repression, and the violence that accompanies them in the US and globally. The liberal organizations are based on assumptions that protection by the state is a marker of success for gay people, and that the Western capitalist nation state can be expanded to include all if we just vote the right people into office. This is simply not true. The liberal strategy of assimilation has brought us to the world that I started with and continues to damage most queer kids. The policies and victories won always afford protection to some at the expense of others. Marriage is cold comfort in the light of the everyday violence and unnecessary death suffered by queer people, especially poor queer people and queer people of color, because they don't have health care, a direct result of liberals and Democrats cowering before the health insurance racket. Marriage is cold comfort in the face of police regularly executing people of color, whilst Democrats cower in the face of police unions. Workplace protection is cold comfort in the face of anti-union right-to-work and at-will employment laws. I can still be fired so long as nobody says out loud that it's because I'm a fag. I'm not denying that the progress of the LGBTQ movement has made a material difference in the lives of some of the population. I'm married to a wonderful man, I'm well-educated, and I'm in a job that affords me health insurance. I probably won't die of AIDS because my race and class position afford me the medication that keeps the HIV inside me in check. Queer folks can now serve openly in the military and police forces, but what kind of victory is it when gay cops can wave a pride flag in the parade, whilst trans people of color are 6 times more likely to die at the hands of police than are their cis counterparts? Is a rainbow crosswalk a meaningless moral gesture in the face of a gay white neighborhood association that calls police on young queer kids of color because they now have nowhere to hang out since gentrification priced the gay bookstore out of the neighborhood? This is Atlanta, and that is where that story comes from. That is true. Now, I may be a leftist, but I'm not stupid. Sometimes we have to make nice with powerful institutions. It is crucial to elect Democrats in this election. The stakes are quite literally existential, both for our country, but also for us queer people and the future we give our kids. But in this bargain, we should always ask, who is hurt, who benefits, who do we have to step over to get it? After years of oppression, it can feel nice to be the popular girl. But there is always a heavy price to be paid for being capitalism's sassy best friend. If we want to help our kids meet the challenges of the new world, we have to teach them to think beyond nation-state and beyond the nation-state electoral politics. In a system that is collapsing under its own weight, on a planet that is dying, now more than ever, we need the kind of fundamental restructuring put forth by the radical gays and queers, not a continuation of the capitalist heteropatriarchy that we've had. So the radical gayness that seeks liberation for all of us, much like the left organizations I spoke about a moment ago, that oppose all forms of oppression in the US and globally, is the only viable way forward for me, for you, and for our kids. Thank you.